Cognitive load theory, in my view, is just as important as attention. So I'm calling cognitive load theory another flagship idea in this learned state domain. And when you understand those two ideas together, attention and cognitive load theory, then you have the tools to massively improve your teaching practice and to make a much bigger difference on the kids in your care. Just recalling our previous video, we saw this pipeline model, if you like, of learning, where we get massive data coming in through the sensory input. That's filtered by attention and passed to working memory, and that's encoded in some way into long-term memory, and at a later time that's retrieved at the right time to solve the right problem or to provide information in the right way. So that model remains important for this discussion, but rather than focusing on attention like in the last video, we're going to focus now on working memory. Here's our metaphor from the previous video of working memory and attention. And you'll remember from that discussion that the coffee filter is a bit like attention, in that there's a lot of inbound substance, in the case of our brain sensory input, and some of that is caught and retained by the filter, and only some is passed through to working memory. Now, a better model for attention, rather than this coffee filter idea, just to again recall the thinking from that previous video, is a torch in a dark room. So if you imagine being in a dark room and passing your torch around the room, whatever you're seeing in the torch beam is what attention is doing for you. It's giving you access to something in the beam and it's ignoring stuff outside the beam. So that's probably a better metaphor for attention. But when we connect attention to working memory, we want to represent it slightly differently. And the key here is that working memory gets some of the stuff through, in fact, a minority of the data coming through from attention and the sensory input. And it has a limit. Once the cup is full, we can't put anything more inside. And you get that sense, you know, when your working memory is full. If I give you a set of instructions to go somewhere and I start to get quite complicated in the way I'm delivering that, after 3 or 4 sets of, or 3 or 4 statements, you start going, oh, hang on, I just can't keep up. And you get that brain is full type feeling. And that's your working memory being full. I'm now building this model out in a slightly different way to show the impact of cognitive load. And so as we understand from the previous model, sensory input being filtered by attention, and that's a massively inadequate representation of how big that attention filter is, and that remaining sensory information is passed through to working memory. A quick chat about working memory and chunks. We know that working memory is limited. Its limit is represented by the chunks of information it can hold. And you can see here 4 graduations. Those 4 graduations in this particular beaker are convenient because we can hold about 4 chunks of information. It used to be considered that we would hold up to 7, and some people can certainly hold more. And with exercise, you can expand your working memory. But for the purposes of this discussion, consider that we can hold about 4 chunks of memory or 4 chunks of information comfortably. As teachers, our job is to increase the size of those chunks. So what we're doing progressively over the years is building the size of the chunks, because there is no limit to the size of the chunk that we can hold. So I can easily recall my credit card number, for instance, because I have 4 chunks of 4 digits. So I now no longer have to refer back to my credit card and look at it to type in when I'm online shopping. I can recall each of those 4 chunks. And I've done that often enough now that those 4 chunks have become 1. So those 16 digits were originally 1 digit, and I had to keep looking backwards and forwards. They became 4 digits in 1 chunk, and over time that's become 16. And that's representative of what we're doing in education over a long period of time. Once we have those chunks of information, then they get passed along to long-term memory and are recalled back into working memory at the right time. So those chunks of my credit card number belong in long-term memory, they're there, and I can recall them and pull them back into working memory to fill out a form online. Or I can pull back a theory or a concept and apply new information to that concept in working memory. So that's the dynamic that's going on. our capacity to do that is affected by three bits or three components of working memory, according to John Sweller's theory. The number of novel elements, elements that are not in my long-term memory, new elements, the number of those new elements that are part of the processing that I'm trying to do increases intrinsic cognitive load or the effort required. So if you introduce a large number of new unknown elements into the effortful process of understanding what's going on, then you're increasing this intrinsic load. Now, one thing about effort, we don't want to reduce this to make it super easy, because as you'll see from Derek Muller's video that's on this page, that's The Science of Thinking by Veritasium, we need effort and discomfort for the brain to better encode information into long-term memory. So there is this sweet spot of desirable difficulty. If we make it too easy, there's not a lot of learning going on. If we make it too hard with too many novel elements, then the effort's too big and we fill up the cognitive load, and we fill up working memory, and therefore it's very hard to process. You know that feeling. So effort is related to the number of novel elements that are being pulled in, and there's a sweet spot. Detracting from that is noise, or what Sweller calls extraneous cognitive load, and this is to do with anything that's not directly involved in the processing itself. If I had on this presentation lots of different fonts, I had fancy transitions, I had GIFs going off, that we're going back 10, 20 years when PowerPoint first appeared on the scene. People filled their page with all sorts of fancy stuff, but this fancy stuff detracts from the capacity to process, and that detraction is seen as noise. This also could be the way I present. Now, I'm aware that today, and I'm a bit tired today in producing this video, that my production, my articulation is not as good as it was in the previous video. So there's lots of ums and ahs, and I'm getting stuck on a few words. And if you do this a lot, well, what I really, it's on the tip of my tongue. That sort of stuff adds to the noise and detracts from your delivery. There are also things that you can be doing the way that you organise your learning materials, and there may be noise in the way that they're represented, the way they're organised, or the way they're designed. So what we want to do is pull away and strip away anything that's not contributing to the processing and the effort required to make sense of the information you're presenting. Now, those two things, effort and noise, intrinsic and extraneous cognitive load, impact heavily on the capacity for this last one. And this last one is germane load, which I'm calling genesis, or it's the generative part. It's the part of the working memory that when you connect and get an answer, when you get some clarity or insight from the effort, from the intrinsic load, you get this, I get it, I know the answer, I connect the dots, I know what's going on. This could be marketing messages, this could be ways that you deliver an idea to people. It could be working through and trying to solve a new problem. It could be something that's completely new that you'd never seen before. And if you have enough effortful load and reduced extraneous load, then there's room left at the top for a bit of this genesis or this germane load. Now, often in our teaching, we unconsciously deliver so much effort and so much noise that there's no room left for genesis. Sometimes in the way that we talk to people and we convey ideas, whether it's in teaching, in leadership, as a parent, or maybe even in trying to sell an idea, there's no room left for genesis. So in anything you do with this theory, you must understand that you have to leave some room at the top of the jar, if you like, for this connective idea, connecting process, the genesis, the germane load to occur. So that's the theory. I'm fascinated by the fact that Sweller himself uses labels that introduce cognitive load. It took me a while to work out what germane was, and for me it was always hard to remember that. So I've turned those back into easy to remember and coloured, if you like, labels: noise, effort and genesis. And these are the three things that you need to consider in your teaching. So where do we take that then? It's important that you consider this in terms of your practice as a teacher, your practice as a leader, anything that's to do with communicating an idea, knowledge, or even selling something. Now, I don't mean selling something in the commercial sense, but selling an idea to people. You need to understand the implications of this theory. So I'm calling out for you to ask you this now. Now that you know this, what's coming up for you? What's starting to bubble up in your mind in terms of the impact of this knowledge and what it might have on your practice and how you are in terms of who you are and what you do. So in other words, I'm at the point where I've given you something at the know level, and I'm asking you to take this idea and push it into the be and the share level and above. What noise are you adding to your classrooms is the key. How do you find out what noise you're adding? It may take someone to video you and you watch your videos back and you say, oh my God, I've said that word. We have those words that we say all the time and they add noise because people notice those words as a habit. And then you might say awesome all the time. And then if you say awesome all the time, people start noticing awesome when you say it and they start making jokes about awesome. But actually, that's noise being taken away from the intrinsic or the effortful part of cognitive load. So when you video yourself, you might start to see some of these unconscious habits that you have, the ums, the ahs, ways that you deliver. These are things that you can assess in terms of your in-session pedagogy, if that makes sense. You can also look at your materials and your design and even your assessment. Your assessment might be adding noise to the impact of assessment through feedback, and kids need to process feedback in a way that adds value. And if we don't give them the opportunity to put effort into understanding an assessment that's been given to them, be it from a peer or a teacher, then we aren't giving them the opportunity to get to germane and saying, I get what this assessment, I get what this feedback is saying to me. So you can see that this has implications in planning, in delivery and assessment. Hope that's been helpful for you.